You're nothing but a dishwasher, Daniel. I'm leaving you for a man with real ambition." Those were the venomous words Melissa Whitmore spat at her husband in front of the entire restaurant staff, her laughter echoing louder than the clatter of pans. What she didn't know was that the man she just humiliated quietly owned every restaurant in the chain. What happened next will make you rethink everything you believe about loyalty, betrayal, and justice. Viewers, if you found out your partner mocked you like this in public, would you forgive them, or plan your own revenge? Drop your answer below. Melissa Whitmore stood in the middle of the bustling restaurant kitchen, her voice slicing through the clatter of pans and the hiss of steam. With a curled lip, she pointed at her husband, Daniel, who was bent over the dish pit, his apron damp and his hands raw from scrubbing. "A dishwasher, Daniel. That's all you'll ever be. And I'm done being dragged down by a man who can't even hold this job." Her laughter rang out, sharp and cruel, echoing through the room where waiters froze mid-step and cooks exchanged uneasy glances. Then, with a tilt of her chin, she turned her gaze toward the tall, confident head chef at the other end of the kitchen, her smile dripping with triumph. Now he's a real man. What Melissa didn't know, what no one dared whisper, was that Daniel owned the entire chain of restaurants she thought she had risen above him to grasp. She mocked a dishwasher, blind to the empire hidden behind his silence. But why did he never fight back? How could a man with everything pretend to have nothing? Who was truly being tested, and what would happen when the truth finally tore the room apart? The kitchen of Copper Ridge Grill was loud with clattering pans, sizzling meat, and steam rising from the dish pit. Daniel Whitmore, in a wrinkled apron, stacked plates taller than his shoulders. He moved methodically, his sleeves rolled, his face calm, a man who carried weight quietly. Then came the sharp click of heels. Melissa Whitmore, his wife of 8 years, stormed into the corridor like a storm through glass. Her eyes, lined perfectly, burned with disdain. She didn't bother lowering her voice, in fact, she raised it so the entire staff could hear. "Another job, Daniel. First you left carpentry. Then you couldn't handle warehouse shifts. Now even dishwashing is slipping out of your hands. You can't even hold on to the one job that requires no brain, just hands." The kitchen froze. Knives halted mid-chop. Pans hissed untended. Even the head cook leaned against the counter, eyebrows raised. Daniel didn't flinch. He wiped his hands on a rag, then quietly resumed stacking glasses. His silence wasn't submission, it was deliberate. But Melissa mistook it for defeat. "Look at you. A 45-year-old man with nothing to show but soap suds. I'm embarrassed to even carry your name," she snapped, arms crossed. The window facing Main Street was open, letting out her venom into the neighborhood air. 2 teenagers on bicycles outside slowed down, peeking in, smirking. Across the street, a couple at the diner patio looked up. Daniel's shame was now a public spectacle. Melissa twisted the knife deeper. She gestured toward Chef Anthony Clark, the tall, broad-shouldered head chef who was plating a steak with flourish. "See him? That's a real man. Ambition. Fire. Not this, nothingness." The room shifted. Anthony smirked but said nothing, pretending to focus on the dish. The waitstaff exchanged quick glances, caught between pity for Daniel and fear of crossing Melissa. Daniel lowered his gaze, but his jaw clenched ever so slightly. The audience, and Emily, his 16-year-old daughter peeking in through the swinging door, could see it. Not weakness. Not shame. A storm kept caged. Melissa leaned close enough that only Daniel could hear her final whisper, "1 month, Daniel. That's all I'll give you to prove you're worth my time. 1 month before I walk away." She spun on her heel and marched out, her perfume trailing arrogance. Daniel set the last glass down, perfectly steady. His silence screamed louder than her words. He knew something no one else in that room, not Melissa, not Anthony, not the gawking staff, understood. Melissa's words lingered long after she left the kitchen, echoing like a sour note in a song that wouldn't end. The staff went back to their stations, but the weight of her humiliation clung to the air. Daniel stacked the last tray of glasses and quietly untied his apron, while his daughter Emily slipped away from the doorway, her face pale with silent questions. Why had her father taken the insults so calmly? Why hadn't he defended himself? To understand Daniel's silence, you had to go back years. Once, he wasn't the man bent over sinks. He had been the architect of half the dining skyline in Dallas, a structural engineer whose projects bore his name on plaques. But a crane accident left him with permanent injuries and a limp that ended his field career. He withdrew, not because he was beaten, but because he wanted to rebuild life on his own terms. He invested quietly, turned his mind to hospitality, and built restaurants with the same precision he once used to design towers. Melissa never knew this. She met him afterward, when he was just another middle-aged man with steady eyes and a modest apartment. She believed she was marrying a safe provider, a man who wouldn't gamble, wouldn't risk. But safety, to her, soon became stagnation. Her childhood had been shaped by the sound of creditors pounding on her parents' door after her father's business failed. She promised herself she would never live that way again. To her, love without ambition was a death sentence. Anthony represented the opposite. His knives flashed, his voice boomed, his charisma filled a room. Melissa saw him not just as a man but as a lifeboat, a way out of the slow, suffocating fear of poverty she had carried since childhood. She never noticed that Daniel's calmness wasn't resignation but discipline. She never wondered why managers seemed to nod at him differently, or why suppliers always greeted him with respect. Emily noticed. She saw the way her father answered late-night calls with words like quarterly reports and supply contracts. She saw the storm he held inside his quiet eyes. She just didn't yet understand the scale of it. Melissa's one-month ultimatum wasn't just a threat. It was the echo of her own terror, the fear of being chained to a man she thought had no fire, when in truth he was hiding embers that could burn down everything she believed in. The Whitmore name had become Melissa's favorite punchline. At a neighborhood barbecue, she held a glass of wine in one hand and used the other to gesture broadly, her voice sharp enough to cut through the chatter. My husband scrubs dishes for teenagers. Imagine that, a 45-year-old dishwasher. She laughed as if it were the most absurd thing in the world. A few neighbors forced chuckles, but others shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Garcia, the retired grocer, shook his head quietly. He had seen Daniel working late nights, never complaining, always steady. He knew dignity when he saw it, but Melissa had no use for dignity. She wanted applause. Daniel stood by the grill, flipping burgers without looking up. The smoke curled around his face, masking the flicker in his eyes. Emily sat nearby, lips pressed tight, scribbling in her journal. She hated when her stepmother turned their life into theater. Later that evening, Melissa slipped out in Anthony's car. They drove to a downtown restaurant, Anthony's arm draped over the wheel with casual arrogance. Over candlelight, he whispered promises Melissa had been starving to hear. With me, you'll never scrub poverty again. You'll be first lady of this chain. Her smile widened, not from love but from hunger. Anthony had a way of filling a room with his presence. He barked orders in the kitchen like a general on the battlefield, his knives flashing under the fluorescent lights. No, no, no. That sauce is too thin. Do it again. Customers pay for perfection, not excuses, he roared, slamming a ladle into the counter. The younger cook scrambled to obey, while Melissa watched from the corner with a satisfied smirk. To her, Anthony's temper meant fire. It meant ambition. It meant everything Daniel lacked. Daniel, meanwhile, had returned to his quiet routines. He washed, stacked, scrubbed, but he also observed. The staff noticed the small things. A supplier who had been ignoring Anthony's calls suddenly dropped by and shook Daniel's hand warmly. Always a pleasure, Mr. Whitmore, the man said with a nod. Melissa scoffed from the other side of the kitchen. See? Even vendors pity you. She didn't catch the supplier's deferential tone. Anthony, however, did. His brow furrowed, though he brushed it off quickly. That night he muttered to Melissa, "Funny how some of these suits act like he's someone. I don't like it." Melissa waved him off. "Don't be ridiculous. He's nothing." But Daniel's calm silence, and those quiet nods of respect, were seeds of doubt Anthony couldn't shake. The courthouse was buzzing with the usual shuffle of papers, lawyers pacing, and anxious voices echoing off the walls. Melissa arrived in a fitted navy dress, her heels striking the tiled floor like gongs of triumph. Anthony walked beside her, chest out, the picture of confidence. They looked less like a woman filing for divorce and more like a couple walking a red carpet. Daniel entered alone. No entourage. No briefcase. Just a plain gray suit that fit a little too loose around the shoulders. He carried himself with the same quiet steadiness he always had. When he sat down, he folded his hands and waited, as if the entire proceeding were nothing more than a formality. The judge read through the paperwork. "Mr. Whitmore, do you contest this divorce?" The room stilled. Melissa's smirk widened, waiting for the protest, for the begging, for the desperate fight she'd already rehearsed responses for. Daniel lifted his eyes, calm and unshaken. "No, Your Honor." "Let her go." Melissa's smirk froze. She wasn't expecting surrender. She was expecting a man to claw, to crumble, to bleed. Instead, he had released her without resistance. As they exited, Anthony leaned in and whispered to her, "See? He looks like a man already buried." Melissa smiled again, but her hands trembled around her clutch. Daniel walked past them, his silence heavier than any outburst. Melissa thought she had stepped into another life. Anthony whisked her into high-end restaurants, poured vintage wine into her glass, and introduced her as "my wife" to people who nodded with admiration. She wore new gowns every week, each one louder and brighter than the last, and walked into rooms with the swagger of a queen. When she saw Daniel passing by in the neighborhood, pushing a grocery cart or walking with Emily, she made sure her laughter carried. "You see, Emily," she once sneered within earshot. "That's what happens when you marry small. But me? I chose big." At first, Anthony delivered. He bought a new car, rented a sleek condo downtown, and took Melissa to galas where chandeliers sparkled like diamonds. But the bills stacked quietly behind the scenes. Anthony's arrogance spilled into the workplace too, shouting at waiters, demanding special cuts of meat flown in from overseas. Melissa clung to the image, ignoring the whispers of staff who muttered, "This won't last." Meanwhile, Daniel remained steady. He still worked in kitchens, still answered phone calls at odd hours. Managers greeted him with subtle nods. Suppliers returned his calls first. And though Melissa thought he was invisible, Daniel was watching everything unfold, silent as stone, waiting. The tension at the Whitmore house was no longer hidden behind closed doors. Emily, quiet and watchful, carried her father's steadiness in her bones, but even she couldn't ignore the venom that filled the air whenever Melissa spoke. One evening, Melissa sat at the dining table polishing her nails while Emily finished homework nearby. Without looking up, Melissa muttered, "Your father will never be more than a dishwasher. He's destined for nothing." Emily's pen froze. Her chest rose and fell once before she lifted her eyes. "Funny," she said, her voice firm, "every time people look at him, I see respect. They never look at you that way." The words cut deeper than Emily realized. Melissa's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with anger. She slammed her hand down on the table, rattling the glass of water. "Don't you dare speak to me that way," she hissed. Daniel appeared in the doorway, calm but commanding. "That's enough," he said softly, his voice carrying more weight than a shout. Melissa looked away, but Emily had already made her point. She had seen through the facade, and Melissa knew it. While Melissa clung to Anthony's flame, that flame was beginning to scorch more than it illuminated. At the restaurant, Anthony's arrogance ballooned. He barked at waiters for bringing the wrong garnish, hurled pans against walls when customers complained, and demanded staff address him as Chef Clark with exaggerated reverence. Melissa, watching from the sidelines, told herself it was passion. It just means he cares about perfection, she reassured her friends over cocktails. But the staff whispered another story, he's cracking. This won't end well. Anthony's recklessness extended beyond temper. He convinced Melissa to co-sign on loans, claiming they were for expansion. He ordered crates of imported truffles and vintage wines, boasting that he would make their branch the crown jewel of the chain. The debt piled quietly, but Melissa ignored the warning signs. She was too enamored with being seen on Anthony's arm, walking into galas in gowns that sparkled under camera flashes. Meanwhile, Daniel was moving in a different kind of spotlight. In a glass-walled boardroom downtown, he sat among executives who leaned forward when he spoke. Reports were spread across the table, profit margins, staffing issues, and one alarming note, reckless spending at the Dallas branch under Chef Clark. He's burning cash we don't have, one director warned. Another added, staff turnover is rising. Complaints are stacking up. Daniel listened quietly, fingers steepled, eyes calm. Finally, he said, not yet. Don't intervene. Let him keep digging. People need to see him for what he is. His voice carried authority, and the directors nodded reluctantly. Daniel wasn't passive, he was patient. The same silence Melissa mistook for weakness at home was, in truth, a strategy sharpened by years of discipline. As Emily defended her father at home, Anthony's arrogance escalated at work, and Daniel positioned his empire for the storm. All the threads were tightening toward a collision no one but Daniel seemed ready for. The invitation came embossed in gold, slipped under Melissa's manicured fingers like a promise. She turned it over and gasped, flashing it at Anthony. The annual restaurant gala. This is it. This is where everyone will finally see us for who we are. Anthony grinned, kissed her cheek, and declared, tonight, we cement our place as royalty. Melissa swelled with pride. She didn't realize she was marching toward her stage of ruin. In the days leading up to the gala, Daniel's silence grew sharper. He stayed late at board meetings, listening to the chatter of directors. The CFO warned, Chef Clark's spending is bleeding profit. Another director muttered, his temper is all over social media clips. Customers are leaving. Daniel steepled his fingers, the same calm posture that frustrated Melissa for years. Don't act yet, he said softly. The truth reveals itself best in the right light. The board members exchanged glances. They didn't fully understand, but they trusted him. Meanwhile, Anthony's arrogance spiraled. At a pre-gala dinner, he toasted loudly, wine sloshing from his glass. Here's to us. The future of this chain belongs to me. Melissa clinked glasses, laughing too loudly, while staff muttered at the edges of the room. Even Emily, seated quietly at her father's side, caught the irony. Her gaze flicked from her stepmother's glittering dress to her father's calm expression. Daniel never corrected them, never boasted, but in his silence she read certainty. The night of the gala glittered with chandeliers, polished marble floors, and tables lined with silver cutlery. Melissa arrived in a flowing gown, crimson red like a warning flame, her arm looped proudly through Anthony's. Cameras flashed as she whispered, tonight, they'll all know who really runs this place. She didn't notice the waiter's eyes shifting toward Daniel, who stood quietly at the back, greeting staff with nods and warm handshakes. Anthony strutted through the ballroom like it belonged to him. He clapped Daniel on the back and sneered, didn't expect to see you here. Careful not to spill the drinks, old man. Melissa laughed, her voice shrill, masking nerve she didn't want to admit. Daniel simply smiled faintly and moved on, as though Anthony's presence barely registered. The speeches began. One by one, executives praised the growth of the chain, its resilience, and its guiding hand. Melissa leaned close to Anthony, whispering, "This is it. They're setting you up." She even raised her glass when she was invited on stage, delivering a smug toast, "To my husband, Chef Anthony Clark, the true future of this empire. Without him, there would be nothing." The applause was polite, restrained. Melissa didn't notice the side glances, the subtle frowns. She only saw her reflection in the crystal glass. At the back of the room, Daniel's daughter leaned closer to him. "Are you going to let her keep saying these things?" she whispered. Daniel placed a hand on hers and murmured, "Patience, Emily. The truth doesn't need to shout." The tension thickened, straining like a violin string pulled to the edge of breaking. The gala wasn't just a celebration. It had become a stage set for justice. And Melissa, in her red dress, had unknowingly stepped into the spotlight of her own undoing. The ballroom lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd. A host stepped onto the stage, adjusting the microphone with a practiced smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight is not just about celebrating another year of growth. It's about honoring the vision, the heart, and the steady hands that built this chain from the ground up." Melissa's heart swelled. She gripped Anthony's arm tighter, her nails digging into his sleeve. She whispered, "This is it. They're about to name you." Anthony puffed his chest, smirking, already rehearsing his victory stride. The host continued, "We owe our success to a man who chose humility over arrogance, who worked quietly, who understood every corner of this business, from boardroom to dish pit." Melissa raised her glass, eyes shining. Her smile froze when the host's voice rang out, "Please join me in honoring Mr. Daniel Whitmore." The ballroom erupted in applause. Chairs scraped, glasses clinked. Executives rose to their feet. Staff cheered. And from the back of the room, Daniel stood slowly, his gray suit catching the light as he made his way forward. Melissa's hand slipped from Anthony's arm. Her glass tilted, red wine spilling down her gown like a bloodstain of pride. Anthony's mouth fell open, eyes darting between Daniel and the applauding executives. "No," Melissa whispered, her voice trembling. "No, it can't be." Daniel shook hands with the host, his smile calm, steady, unhurried. Executives pressed close, eager to congratulate him. "The foundation of this empire," the host declared, "a man who never forgot the dignity of work." Melissa's world caved in. She remembered every sneer, every cruel word, every time she'd mocked Daniel in front of others. Her mind replayed the barbecue, the courthouse, the late-night whispers to Anthony. She had mocked him for scrubbing dishes while he was quietly holding the empire in his hands. Anthony, red-faced, hissed under his breath, "You tricked me. You made me think he was nothing." Melissa turned to him, desperate, but he shoved her hand away. "You were supposed to be my ticket in. Instead, you tied me to a man who owns me." His voice was low, sharp as a blade. On stage, Daniel took the microphone. He didn't gloat. He didn't even look at Melissa. "Thank you," he said simply. His voice carried like steel wrapped in velvet. This chain was built not on titles or power plays, but on the backs of men and women who scrub, cook, serve, and clean. Success is not measured by how loudly you shout, but by how deeply you respect. The applause thundered again. Emily, seated near the stage, beamed at her father, pride flooding her young face. Melissa, trembling, tried to force a smile, tried to hold her head high, but she felt the stares around her. She wasn't the glamorous queen anymore, she was the woman who mocked her own husband, blind to his greatness, parading herself on the arm of a man who was already unraveling. The lights glowed brighter on Daniel. For the first time, Melissa saw him not as the man she dismissed, but as the storm she had never understood. And in that moment, she realized her month-long ultimatum had been a test she had already failed. The gala ended in a thunder of applause, but for Melissa, the noise had become a dull roar in her ears. She stumbled out into the parking lot, her red gown stained from spilled wine, her breath shallow, her pride shattered. Anthony marched beside her, face tight with rage. "You tricked me," he hissed, shoving the car keys into his pocket. "All this time, you made me believe he was a nobody." Melissa spun toward him, eyes desperate. "How was I supposed to know, Anthony? He never told me." Anthony cut her off with a bitter laugh. "Don't you get it? He didn't have to. Everyone else already knew. The staff, the board, even the damn suppliers. I married a queen, but tonight I stood beside a fool." He yanked open the car door, slid inside, and slammed it shut. Melissa reached for the handle, but he locked it, rolled down the window just enough to spit his last words, "You were leverage. Now you're dead weight." The tires screeched as he sped away, leaving her alone in the glow of the street lamps. The next morning, Melissa appeared outside one of Daniel's restaurants, her hair unkempt, her makeup smeared. She spotted him leaving a staff meeting, Emily at his side. Melissa rushed forward, her voice cracking. "Daniel, please. I didn't know. I was wrong. Give me another chance. We can fix this." Daniel stopped, looking at her with calm pity. Emily's hand tightened around his arm, her glare sharp. Melissa's eyes darted between them, desperate for a sliver of mercy. "You had your chance," Daniel said finally. His voice was steady, almost gentle. "When there was nothing to gain. Now you want what I built, not who I am." Melissa's knees weakened. She tried to answer, but the words collapsed into sobs. Daniel guided Emily toward the waiting car, never glancing back. News spread quickly in the weeks that followed. Anthony had been fired from the chain, his financial recklessness and explosive temper caught on camera and shared online. A viral clip showed him throwing a pan at a line cook, the caption branding him a bully. No fine restaurant would hire him now. He ended up at a roadside diner, flipping greasy burgers under buzzing fluorescent lights, a chef who once mocked a dishwasher reduced to worse than dish duty. Melissa's fall was quieter but crueler. The loans Anthony signed under her name dragged her into debt. The condo was repossessed, the car towed, her jewelry pawned for pennies. Friends who once toasted her victories now ignored her calls. She worked as a waitress in a cheap diner, serving coffee for tips. Each tray she carried reminded her of the man she had ridiculed. For Emily, the story was different. She flourished. She walked beside her father at conferences, listened to his speeches, and began to see her own future in his empire. At dinner one night, she told him, "Mom would have been proud." Daniel smiled, his hand resting over hers. "And I'm proud of you." Melissa watched from afar sometimes, broken, bitter, aching. But Daniel never looked her way again. Melissa's world shrank fast. Once, she strutted in gowns beneath chandeliers, glasses clinking in her honor. Now she woke up to eviction notices and calls from creditors that made her chest ache. The condo she flaunted to her friends was repossessed, her car driven away on the back of a tow truck. She stood on the curb in the same heels she once wore to galas, watching her reflection vanish in the tinted windows. At night, she sat alone at the kitchen table of a rundown rental, the silence gnawing. The diamond ring Anthony once slipped on her finger was gone, pawned for a fraction of its value. In its place was a faint band of pale skin, a ghost of the life she thought she had secured. Her phone buzzed with messages from debt collectors. The women who once sipped wine with her no longer answered her calls. They had moved on to newer stories, fresher scandals. Melissa had become old gossip. Meanwhile, Daniel's world expanded. His restaurants thrived under his guidance. Instead of tightening his grip, he loosened it. He raised wages for staff, added scholarship programs for culinary students, and funded health benefits that made competitors shake their heads in disbelief. When asked why, he told a reporter simply, "A chain is only as strong as the hands that hold it together." The media adored him, but Daniel kept his humility. At board meetings, he was the same calm presence, listening more than speaking. His quiet leadership drew loyalty from employees who once thought of him as just another dishwasher. Now they knew the truth, he had walked in their shoes by choice. Respect for him wasn't commanded, it was earned. Emily blossomed in the glow of her father's steady example. At school, she excelled, her essays carrying wisdom far beyond her years. She wrote about dignity, about strength hidden in silence, about how real power doesn't shout. Teachers praised her, classmates admired her. At home, she studied business journals, her mind fixed on one day joining her father in steering the empire. Melissa saw glimpses of this new life from the shadows. Once, she lingered across the street from one of Daniel's restaurants, watching him step out surrounded by smiling staff and a proud Emily at his side. She felt a lump in her throat as she remembered how she once mocked those very smiles. She turned away before anyone could see her, her reflection in the restaurant window too painful to confront. Her shifts at the diner dragged. Each time she carried a tray of steaming coffee or wiped down a sticky booth, she thought of the day she ridiculed Daniel for scrubbing plates. That memory burned more than the blisters on her hands. She had traded loyalty for ambition, and now she had neither. The world had rearranged itself. Daniel rose higher, not by stepping on others but by lifting them. Emily's path stretched wide with promise. And Melissa. Melissa served strangers in silence, her laughter gone, her crown of arrogance shattered into shards she could never piece back together. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and fried onions, the kind of place where nobody lingered longer than they had to. Melissa tied her apron tighter around her waist and balanced a tray with chipped mugs. Her feet ached in shoes that had once clicked proudly on marble floors. Now they scuffed across greasy linoleum. She approached a booth where a young family waited, smiling politely as she set down their plates. The child thanked her, and for a moment, Melissa's chest squeezed. She remembered Emily at that age, bright-eyed, curious, always tugging at Daniel's sleeve. Regret rose like bile, but she swallowed it down and forced a smile. The bell above the door jingled. Melissa turned, and her breath caught in her throat. Daniel stepped inside, taller somehow, his gray suit neat but unpretentious. Beside him walked Emily, no longer the quiet girl scribbling in her journal, but a young woman radiating confidence. She wore a tailored blazer, her hair pinned back, her presence commanding. Melissa's hands trembled so badly that one of the mugs rattled on the tray. They didn't notice her at first. Daniel greeted the hostess warmly, shaking hands with an old busboy who now worked at the diner. Emily laughed at something her father whispered, her face lit with pride. Melissa watched, heartbreaking. That laughter used to fill her own home, but she had traded it for chandeliers and empty promises. When their eyes finally met, Daniel's expression didn't change. No anger. No triumph. Just a calm nod, as if acknowledging someone he once knew but no longer carried in his life. Emily, however, looked away, her jaw tight. To her, Melissa was no longer family, just a ghost of betrayal. Melissa stood frozen, tray clutched against her chest. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to beg, to explain. But no words came. The gulf between them was wider than wealth, wider than pride. It was the gulf carved by choices she could never undo. Daniel and Emily took their seats, ordering simple meals. They laughed, talked, shared plans about the future. Melissa watched from behind the counter, unseen, her eyes glistening. Every smile between father and daughter was a reminder of what she had thrown away. As they left, Daniel held the door open for Emily, the evening sun framing them in golden light. Melissa stepped forward instinctively, but stopped herself. She realized then that she had no place in their story anymore. Out on the street, Daniel's voice carried softly, almost like a closing note to a song. People chase status, he told Emily, but forget character. True wealth isn't counted in dollars, but in loyalty, patience, and love. Betrayal destroys faster than poverty ever will. The car door shut, and the engine hummed to life. Melissa pressed her hand against the diner's glass, watching as they drove away, their taillights glowing like distant stars. Alone in the reflection, she saw herself, apron stained, crown shattered, dignity lost. And for the first time, she understood, Daniel's silence had never been weakness. It had been strength, waiting for the truth to speak louder than her pride ever could.